Hey everybody, thanks again for joining me. It's Azure Chris here, and we're going to continue on our 10 steps to get started with Azure for Partners. Today we're talking about number 7, and that's Azure networking. So we've already touched on Azure networking, right? We talked a little bit about Azure Virtual WAN, right? We talked about VPNs and creating links between on-prem and Azure, right? We talked about ExpressRoute and things like that. Now we're going to take a step up. I want to take a broader view of Azure networking and all the different services, right? And because networking is such a big topic, Microsoft puts them into 4 different buckets. And the first one would be connectivity services, right? And that consists of the Azure Virtual WANs and the Express routes. But at the heart of it all is VNets or virtual networks, right? And that's really what we use to create that traditional IP space and subnets that allows you to connect infrastructure as a service or virtual machines and Azure resources together, right? The second bucket is application protection services. So that can consist of Azure Firewall or network virtual appliances, whether you're leveraging Fortinets or Palo Altos, things like that, but to protect your workloads. Something else could be web application firewall, right? And NSGs that actually make up the rules in Azure Firewall, where you're blocking, denying traffic between different workloads, right, based on a port and an IP address. The third bucket would be application delivery services, right? And that could be whether Azure Front Door, maybe something like that, where you're serving an application that's geo-redundant load balancing, right? So if you have a web app in different regions, if one goes down, the other one keeps going, or you want to serve the content from the closest network or IP address. And you can also leverage another one of those services and delivery services, which is CDN, right? If you're deploying something to a far region away from the source and you want to cache it for proximity to remove latency. Another service in delivery services is load balancing. So if you want to put a web application in Azure and you want to serve it and do round robin or something like that between virtual machines, load balance is the option for you, right? So the fourth bucket is network monitoring, right? So just like traditional networks on-prem, how would you troubleshoot this stuff, right? How would you make sure that VNet to VNet traffic is all set, or subnet to subnet, or maybe you're troubleshooting through the VPN, right? That's when you use something like Network Watcher. So those are the 4 buckets that Microsoft puts together when they're talking about networking. In this example, I wanted to put a high-level kind of touch base on some of the different services that we just talked about, right? So you have your Azure subscription, you have your Azure Active Directory, right, with your namespace. And say I wanted to create 2 different resource groups and I have 2 different VNets in each resource group. This VNet could be a 10.10.0.0 with a /16 with a subnet underneath it, 10.10.1.0 with a /24. And say I have an availability set. Maybe it's Active Directory, right, with 2 different servers and availability set. And I have a scale set here that's connected to some blob storage. And I have one subnet that I said, right? By default, these resources under that one subnet would be able to communicate freely, right? Like normally just on a regular network. If I wanted to lock down the communication here, I would have to leverage a network security group. And I could create a rule that says, hey, this scale set can only communicate to this availability group over a certain port, maybe for Active Directory services, right, LDAP. And I could apply that at the subnet level, or I could apply it down at the resource, actually the VNIC level. So I can really get granular with my rules there. So then here I have another resource group with a different VNet, right? And I could have this as a 10.20.0.0 /16 IP space, and maybe a couple of subnets underneath it with a 10.20.1.0 and a 10.20.2.0, both with a /24. Maybe it's a 2-tier application, right? Maybe, like I said, I have the load balancer, 2 virtual machines with port 80 and 443 open, and they're serving out a web application to the world. Here I would have the 2 subnets, and by default, they would be able to communicate with each other. And in the backend, I could have an Azure SQL database. What if I wanted to secure that? I'd have to leverage a network security group, right? Or I can leverage Azure Firewall, which is really just a portal in another portal in a blade in the Azure portal that really is a collection of NSGs, right? And I could apply rules that says these virtual machines can only communicate to Azure SQL database on, the SQL Server port, right? And I can block that communication, right? Or I can use a private endpoint if it's a PaaS service to lock that down. So like I said, by default, subnet to subnet traffic is open, right? And you'd have to leverage security services to block it. But by default, VNet to VNet traffic is blocked. So this VNet cannot communicate with this VNet, even if it's in the same resource group or anywhere in Azure. It's just blocked by default. In order to enable this communication, I'd have to leverage Azure VNet peering. Now, maybe you don't want to, you want them isolated, right? That's a good feature to have. So in an example, a different scenario, maybe I'd have both resource groups would look exactly the same. They'd both be a two-tier architecture, but I wouldn't want this one to communicate with this one, maybe because this was my dev environment and this was my production environment, and I have a CI/CD pipeline and with my developers coding right into the dev environment, and they're deploying infrastructure as a code using blueprints or what have you, and I don't want these two networks to communicate with each other, right? That's a great use case for having different VNets and isolating traffic. But in this scenario, I want to have my users authenticate against the domain controllers here, but I want to put it in a different network because it's core services. I would have to leverage VNet peering. So that's creating rules where you have one VNet to communicate with another VNet. And say I had a VPN here that was communicating offsite to a data center. I would have to enable service chaining, so this VNet could then talk to this VNet and then traverse the VPN and go out and talk to end users on-prem or what have you. So this is really high level. This is kind of a 40-foot view or mile-high view of Azure networking here. I want to jump on the desktop. I want to go a little bit through the theory a little bit more, show you a lab that's great hands-on. You get your hands dirty, and hopefully you can find this information useful and use it on your day-to-day. Let's just jump right into it. Hey everybody, thanks again for sticking with me. It's Azure Chris, and we're going to continue on our 10 steps to get started with Azure for Partners, and we're talking about number 7, networking with Azure, right? So you saw my introduction, we went high level, all the different buckets, right? And I really wanted to give you kind of a landing page here, azurechris.com. And I go through the documentation, right? So this is a great place to start. If you want to get your hands dirty, if you want to get into understanding networking Azure, this is a great place to start. First, the link I have here is Configure and Manage Virtual Networks for Azure administrators. And you can click on this link, and the first thing it does is it takes you to the Azure Learn modules. So if you guys have seen some of my other videos, you already know I love Azure Learn. I think it's a great place to start. You can get your hands dirty. You can try some of the technology out in a sandbox. You don't have to pay for anything. So it's a great place to start. And if you go through this module, this will help you get your AZ900, so your Azure Fundamental certification. So if you're looking to get that, might as well just start this, get your hands dirty, and that'll give you the exposure you need to pass the exam. So high level, configure networks for your virtual machines, right? So what we talked about, infrastructure as a service, virtual machines, how do you get the IP space set up, right? Talks about VPN gateway, some of the other stuff we've talked about before, previous videos, express route, right? We then drill down into IP address schema, right, and setting up the IP address space, things to consider there. We then talk about integrating different virtual networks, right, with VNet peering, right? When I talked about you have your different VNets, by default they're blocked. How do you set that up? This whole module is dedicated to that, and they teach you how to do it with the Azure CLI with command line, which is my favorite. Then drill down into service endpoints and network security groups, right? We talked about how to lock that stuff down. So great content here. You can drill down and you can kick these labs off and really get your hands dirty. We jump back to my blog page here, and I wrote about the 4 buckets, right? The connectivity services and all the different stuff. And I really wanted to give you a landing page for understanding VNets, right? And all the things that wrap around VNets. And I give you a little diagram here. And we click on the link, and it's going to take you to the Microsoft documentation about what is Azure Virtual Networks. And they talk about the communication, right? VNets, IP spacing, outbound connections, public IP addresses, load balancers, connectivity between Azure resources, right? Through a virtual network or through virtual network service endpoints, right? When I talked about Azure Platform as a Service offerings and securing those things, that's what we talk about, service endpoints. You then talk about network VNet peering, right? And there's a link there, and I have some other links here on my blog page as well. We talk about communicating with on-premise resources through VPN, point-to-site, site-to-site, express route, filtering network traffic with network security groups and application security groups. Depending on if you have a group of servers that are serving one application, you can create a tag and then create rules based on that application tag there, right? We then talk about routing network traffic, route and user-defined routing tables. So if you have different VNets, how do you route the traffic between the VNets, right? Or between on-prem and Azure, right? You would need to leverage route tables and maybe BGP protocol, right? A border gateway protocol to enable that. So you can drill down here, talk about pricing, limits, and all that stuff. Pricing, one thing to understand, anything that leaves Azure, egress traffic, that's what you get charged on. Anything that stays inside Azure, generally there's no charge. So that's good kind of high level guidance there. And I'll close this and go back to my blog page here. Some more of a write-up talking about on-prem stuff. You can read that. I then have another link that'll take you directly to network peering, right, and kind of what is involved around that and things to consider when you're talking about VNet peering. Quick read, 6 minutes here, and it goes down to, you know, why even use it, right? Low latency, high bandwidth, ability to communicate with resources in different virtual networks, right? Transferring data between virtual networks across subscriptions. So you can communicate between one subscription and another under, you know, the same tenant, and you can have communication. And maybe that is for a dev environment and a prod environment. So really powerful there. Talks about the connectivity, service chaining, right? Like I talked about, when you have a gateway subnet and you have a VPN and you want to share services between your VNets, that's service chaining, right? We then talk about gateways and on-premise connectivity, right? All this stuff works together, and the troubleshooting and diagnostics, and we'll talk about that a little bit. So all the stuff, keep in mind, virtual network documentation, you can drill down into here. You can look at more tutorials. You can look at samples. You can get even, you know, how-to guides, planning and configuring, and we'll touch on that a little bit as well. So I drill down here, and I wanted to give you another lab. So the other one was for the fundamentals. This one is for solutions architects. Now, some of the labs might be in both modules, but this one drills down into some of the more advanced stuff. If you're already past some of the basics and you want to drill down deeper, this is a great module if you want to go for your solutions architect badge. And we talk about VNet gateways and kind of all that stuff. The express routes. This one we saw in the other module as well, right? VNet pairing was in the other module. But then we get to traffic manager, right? So that's one of the deployment services or delivery services. We then talk about setting up Azure Load Balancer, right? And kind of all the features and what's available there. So really some great labs, like I said, all for free. Drill into the stuff, get your hands dirty, and go get those certs. Go get some experience under your belt. The next link I have, you know, surprises, this is actually a great diagram here where I talk about, you know, the 3-tier architecture where you have your web tier, your business middle tier, middle layer, and your middleware, and then your SQL backend or your data tier backend. So really great diagrams if you want to working with customers and you need some diagrams here, you can pull this right off my site. We then drill down into securing your network, right? So now you have your network set up. How do I secure that stuff? And I talked about Azure Firewall, right? I talked about the network security rules. This is all the documentation. So we drill down into it. It talks about, you know, limits and, you know, what to name them, the priorities based on, you know, rules, just like other firewall rules. There are always priorities and, you know, which rule has the priority over the other ones. It's based on source and destination, right, with the IP address, with CIDR notation /24s, and you can use different things like application, resource security groups, and all that stuff like I talked about. You can base it on your ports, TCP, UDP. We can talk about direction, inbound and outbound. Some could be port ranges, right, or a specific port, and you can, you know, do it on allow or deny, right? And then if you scroll down, they actually have some examples, right? So VNet inbound, right? What do I want to allow any? And then we talk about allowing load balancer inbound rules. And you can lock that down for any port or specific port, right? And then they have some deny rules here. So really some good stuff. And then they have some Azure platform considerations, right? So how to lock down these mechanisms and what security you should be thinking about. So great stuff here. Also drilling down, this is the security part of the virtual network. You can get into more of the stuff like I talked about, application security groups, service tags, service endpoints, and a lot of stuff there. So we jump back into the blog page, and now we're going to get into the delivery services like I talked about, Azure Front Door. And when we have serving out an application, right? Say www.yourapplication.com, you have multiple regions, you have users in maybe the United States, and maybe some in Europe, and maybe some in Asia, and you want to use global site load balancing, you would use Azure Front Door. So you can click on this link, and you can see that diagram that I have there, the topology. It's layer 7. HTTP, HTTPS to lock it down. Talks about backend health monitoring. So if one site goes down, the other one will keep going and you'll notify. Talk about routing methods and traffic manager and when to use what, SSL offload and some of the health probe links and things like that, and talk about pricing. So great place to start. And just like some of the other links, you have tutorials, you have samples, and you have how-to guides. So great stuff here as well. We jump back out, and now we're going to get into the network monitoring. So, if you had to troubleshoot this stuff and you set it up, how would you get a look into, the packets and where they're going, or if they're dropping between Azure and maybe through your VPN? You would use Network Watcher. So some great stuff here for monitoring, and they help you set up routing next hops, right, and user-defined routes, and making sure that stuff is working correctly. You can then drill down into the relationships between your VNet, your subnets, and then your resources, whether it's a VNet or an NSG, and kind of how all that relationship is built out. And you get that topology view here. And then they talk about the diagnostics, right, with the network traffic filtering, filtering out problems and drilling down into that, your next hops and things. So really great here. There's an overview, and I think, Azure networking overview. This is actually a different page. So there are a couple of different Microsoft docs that you can drill down into to get Azure, to talk about Azure networking. And this is a different one, but great stuff here for you to look at. So we jump back into my documentation here. It's the last kind of write-up where I talk about some of the other services with Network Watcher, Express Route Monitor, Azure Monitor, which is also a great monitoring tool for looking at workloads and to see kind of what resources they're using, and Log Analytics Workspace. And also there's a VNet terminal tap. Maybe you want to look at port monitoring or mirroring for maybe an IDS or something like that. So then there's another link here I provided. This is another link to Microsoft documentation. I think this is a great thing for Microsoft partners. If you're going to start building out your customer's network, you don't really know what to think of. Maybe you've never done it in prod, and you just want to make sure that you're thinking of all the things and have them all planned out. This is a great place to start. 10-minute read. Think about naming, nomenclature, conventions, subscriptions across the different resource groups, your regions, what you would consider for communication between on and offshore. Your latencies, your geographic regions, availability zones. So if one Azure data center went down, would you have resiliency in another? The IP segmentation, just like VLANs and subnets, virtual networks, right? And how you're gonna kind of slice and dice those IP and private IP spaces, your connectivity, your site annotation, your subnets underneath that. We talked about gateway subnets. So great stuff here. Traffic filtering, security, really goes into all the stuff that you need to think about when you're gonna plan and design your network. So I wanted to provide that as well. So we jump back into this, and really this is the high level. Like I said, it's a lot of documentation, plenty of information for you to jump into. Let's just jump into the Azure portal. I'll show you what a virtual network looks like real quick, some IP space, and hopefully you can find that useful. So we're here in the Azure portal, and we start at our kind of dashboard here. We can go here and look at the icons. I have my virtual network here, or I can also type in virtual network and you can see it come up. And I would click on that. Now I already have a virtual network created, and just like my introduction, right, I had the two different VNets created. One was my core services, the other one was that kind of application that I had with the load balancer. This would be where I have my domain controller, right? And I can click on this, and it will right away show me the blade for virtual networks, right? And I can see my address space, my subnets, firewalls, DNS servers, and you see peering as well, right? But first here in the overview page, it's already telling me what are my connected devices. I don't really have much here. I have one network interface. It gives me the IP address and it tells me what subnet is connected. That's fantastic already. What if I wanted to create, you know what, let me drill down into the IP space and I'll show you that first, right? So we have the IP space, it's the 10.10.0.0 like I had in the intro with that /16, and I would have drilled down into the subnets and you see I have VLAN 1, and that's the 10.10.1.0/24, and that's where I have like my domain controller and stuff like that, right? But if I were to jump back out and I wanted to add a virtual network, right? I wanted to say, okay, we have that core virtual network, let's add another one. I want to put it in the same resource group. I could create another resource group. I could call it, you know, app resource group, and I say okay, and I'm going to call this app VNet, and I would put this maybe in the same one, East US, and okay, let's go to the IP address spacing. So the other VNet I had was 10.10.0.0. I want to make this one just like my intro, 10.20.0.0 with the /16. And I click on that and that's great. I can do that. I then want to add some subnets, right? In the intro, I had a couple of subnets, right? I had one for my web front end and I had one for my Azure SQL database. So let's do web front end, and I'll give this one 10.20.1.0/24, and there we go. We're all set. I can add that VNet and it's got a name. And I want to add a second one. Maybe I call this one SQL backend, right? And I can give this one 10.20.2.0/24. And what if I want to do the private endpoint? There I can secure it. I can say Microsoft SQL, and now I have a private endpoint where I'm securing connectivity between anything in this VNet to this one service for the Microsoft SQL PaaS services. So it's really some fantastic, really easy to create a virtual network. Imagine in a physical layer on a data center, I'd have to rack and stack all these network switches and all this stuff, and then carve out the VLANs on each device. I just did it here. I can go to the next tab. I can look at securing some stuff. If I wanted a bastion host, if I didn't want public access through a public IP, I would leverage a bastion host. I can enable that here. I can do DDoS protection for my web front end, or I can enable Azure Firewall from here. I can apply tags, things like that. I can review and create. So really that's high level. That's what I wanted to show you guys. Networking in kind of a high level overview. I know it's a lot to digest. If you guys have any other questions, feel free to reach out to me. Click like, click subscribe. I hope you find this useful. Join me on the next video. We're going to talk about VMs or virtual machines for step number 8. And yeah, click like, click subscribe. I hope you like it. Leave some feedback. And yeah, hopefully you can join me for the next video. And I look forward to talking to you again. Take care.